So hello everybody, and I'm going to focus on what does storytelling really mean in a market research presentation. First of all, why are we doing storytelling? Well, it provides more impact. It's more memorable. It's so much easier to remember a story than a collection of facts or individual items. It's easier to understand. So if you're in the audience and you're listening to the story, it fits together like a jigsaw, like a novel. You end up with more understanding. The process is more enjoyable, engaging. Now that's got lots of implications. It means it's going to be easier to get senior management to attend the debrief, the presentation, because they're going to know they're going to end up understanding it, that it's not going to be tedious, it's not going to be boring. As a consequence of all that, storytelling is more likely to result in your message being communicated, and it's more likely to result in your message being acted on. And finally, it shows that you understand the data and the question. You actually can't tell a good story unless you know what the story is. You can't write a good story without understanding the business question, the data, and the implications for that. So I'm going to show you an example from one of my favorite books on this topic, really, Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. And they write about a study back in the 1990s which looked at the sort of popcorn eaten in USA movie theaters. And this was the medium bag of popcorn. And what they discovered when they did the research was that there were 37 grams of saturated fat. And they had some other data. They knew that the recommended amount, the recommended maximum of saturated fat was 20 grams. So they've got 37 grams, the recommended amount is 20. The problem is almost nobody knows what 20 grams looks like. Almost nobody knows what 37 grams look like. And we have the issue about whether or not more is actually bad for you. Anyway, it has to be communicated. So what did they do? So they wanted to communicate the message in this piece of data. So what they did was they organized a press conference, and they said, okay, we're going to tell you about how much saturated fat there is in a medium-sized bag of popcorn. And they then pointed to a table they'd set out and said, it's the same as a fried breakfast, a McDonald's lunch, and a steak and fried potatoes dinner. One bag of medium popcorn is the same as 3 unhealthy meals. That is the story. The story isn't 37 grams. That's part of what made the story. It's not 20 grams is the recommended amount. It's that one bag of medium popcorn has the same saturated fat as 3 unhealthy meals. And that is what we're looking to do. We're trying to create emotion that is moving people towards an action. And the action here is don't eat the popcorn, or share the popcorn with several people. Now, when we talk about market research and story building, we need to focus on narrative flow. That is the key to the storytelling process. Now, the narrative flow is a thread that takes the audience from the start to the end. There should be no breaks in the path. We don't want people to have to jump from one part of the path to another. We don't want them to have to climb a wall in order to stay on the path. We don't want any diversions from the path. People will frequently tell you it's the need to know, not the nice to know. The need to know is things that are on the path. The nice to know are distractions, things that take you off the path, which divert you from getting from the beginning to the end. And it's got to be as engaging as possible. We want the path to be fun. We want it to be thought-provoking. We want it to be absorbing so that we get from the beginning to the middle to the end. So this narrative flow for a market research story is a very traditional, very simple story. Beginning, middle, end. It's not War and Peace with lots of different plots and an immense amount of history. It's not something like the movie Pulp Fiction, which cuts from the future to the past back to the present and disorientates you. It's not something like an Agatha Christie story, which has red herrings. It's got to take you beginning, middle, and end. So the story flow is linear. it moves forward. It's cumulative. As we go through the story, the audience should be learning more stuff, feeling more emotion, and they should be aware that it's cumulative. There should be some repetition. Remember, you as the storyteller know the story inside out, so you're not going to forget the key elements. But the audience are hearing it potentially for the first time. So think about comedy, the running gag. Think about songs where we have the chorus. Think about memes, the idea of repeating key elements, not using exactly the same words, but keeping the concept being refreshed. It wants to be focused. It wants to be focused on the do that you're going to aim to achieve at the end of it, focused on the story and not on the distractions. And it should have a developing momentum. The story should get more and more meaningful as we get towards the end. There can be a problem with market research presentations that the first little bit is really punchy, and then it kind of drifts because it's more and more and more data. So we want to develop momentum in our presentation. The start is absolutely crucial, and the start is something that market researchers often murder. So let's look to literature and great storytelling. Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. We know this is about families. We know this is not going to end well. We know that there's going to be a lot of sorrow in this story. Pride and Prejudice from Jane Austen. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. We know from the opening line that it's about a certain class in society. We know that this is going to be about relationships between men and women, and we know that it's going to be the perception of a woman in that process. This one here is probably more distressing in some ways. Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar. It was a queer, sultry summer. The summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. We know already that this is The Lost Soul. This was an autobiographical story written not long actually before Sylvia Plath committed suicide, and that comes through so strongly in the opening line. Now let's think about this hypothetical opening for a market researcher. Today I will thank you for being here. Then I will tell you about you. Then I will talk a lot about me for quite a while. Then I shall recite whole slabs of data from the research we conducted, and then I'll make a few caveated conclusions. And we lose the audience right from the start. How about we start with a statement more like this? To steal from Mark Twain, the reports of the death of retail are greatly exaggerated. So I set the tone. We're talking about retail, and I am going to offer you some hope for the future of retail. Things aren't as bad as other people are saying. Now, one of the things you want to do with storytelling is build the story. And people will often say to me, but Ray, my client says I've got to start with a management summary, and that gives the end away. Well, that's actually not a problem. So here is an example. The management summary starts with, these children have tangible problems because they can't afford school and they are physically, emotionally stressed. Now, let me explain how we got to that point. And I'm going to show you the architecture of that story here. Each one of these boxes was probably going to be a slide. It might be a video. It might be a piece of evidence. But I'm just showing you the architecture. So I would start off by saying, okay, we talked to some children. We found out that many of them didn't have uniforms and they didn't have books. They had a lack of school materials. We found out that they couldn't afford the school fees, and actually they couldn't pay the cost to get to and from school. So we have this issue about them being unable to pay school costs. All of that links together in the fact that so many of them can't afford to go to school. We also talked about the psychological issues. They were worried about the rest of the family. Their mind was thinking about their family and the people who needed them. They were worrying about their dependents. Because of some of these issues, they were often tired in school. They often talked about having headaches. They were feeling exhausted in the school situation. So we could see they were physically and emotionally stressed. And we pull all of that together with these children have tangible problems. So even though I told you the conclusion on the first slide, I can still take you through the story of how we get there. Now, an architecture for the story is really important. There should be a link between all of the pieces. I don't want any missing boxes. I don't want any boxes that are not connected to other boxes. That structure is really important, but it's not always visible. I wouldn't share this structure necessarily when I'm telling the story, but I need to have created it and I need to be using it. Now, when we come to use our narration, we want to match it to the narrative of the build. And I'm going to show you how I do that in a second. And one of the things you will often do is ask the audience to guess ahead in order to keep that engagement high. So here is an example from some data I collected many, many years ago about how many alcoholic drinks did people drink during the last weekend. And I've compared London and Manchester in the United Kingdom. And I would start by asking the audience, now, which of those do you think is going to be consuming the most alcohol? And how many people do you think are consuming no alcohol over the weekend? And then I would show them the data and say, okay, between a quarter and a third of people didn't have any alcohol over the weekend before they took this survey. And then we see that the data is very similar between London and Manchester in terms of one. And we also get a realization that having one alcoholic drink is quite strange. Having none is perfectly normal. But having one and then stopping across the whole weekend is a relatively rare phenomenon. Now we start to see a difference. In London, nearly 3 times as many people had 2 to 4 drinks. Again, in London, more people had 5 to 9 drinks. And yes, what's coming next? And I would pause and somebody would say out loud, Manchester are drinking a lot. And I would go, yes, Manchester, nearly 50% are having 10 or more drinks. More than nearly 50% are saying they have 10 or more drinks over the weekend. So that is how I'm building the narration, and I'm building the slides, and I'm building the story to make the flow work. I'm doing that to generate a think, feel, do. What the think is, what does your data say the story is? The feel are the emotional levers that I'm going to use to tell that story. And the do is the reason I'm telling the story. And you can't tell a good story if you don't know the do. You can't tell a good story if you don't have a story. Here are 2 examples of telling a story from those 3 pieces. So I've done a concept test, and people often say a concept test is really difficult to tell a story because you've just got the basic data. And the story is relatively straightforward. First of all, option A scored 75%. That's the think, it's the data. The do is it should be launched. And to do that, I want to convey not just the numbers, but the emotional messages that came from the people that we interviewed. So John in Sydney said, if you can make a healthy option taste this good, then I will switch. I want to lose weight, but I can't compromise on taste. So I'm going to mix together the think, the data, with emotional messages in the data to help convince the client this is why this is a good option. Maybe we have a brand tracker. People often say, oh, nothing really changes from month to month in the brand tracker. How do we create stories? What we're going to do is we're going to pick something to focus on. So I've looked at the data, the think, and it looks like there is something really interesting about Singles Day. So I'm now going to identify the do, which is my client needs to focus more on singles. Not just Singles Day, but singles. And then I will say, okay, the top products in the singles are looking at are X, Y, and Z. That is the think. But to help make that work, I'm going to show a video of a man in Shanghai talking about his need to spend himself. So I'm blending together, as I go through my narration, information and emotional levers so that we get to the right conclusion. So in that conclusion, we start by finding the story. We create the architecture for that story. Then we craft the narration that builds to the destination at the end of the path. And for those of you familiar with Wizard of Oz, obviously we want to get to Oz at the end of the process. So you need to know where the end is, and then you're going to work out how to get there. We're going to use storytelling devices. We're going to use humor, prediction, games, theater, immersion, entertainment, any of these tools you like to keep people on the path. The story is the path. The storytelling is how we use all of these devices to get us there. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ray. So, Ray, you've had the benefit of presenting at the end of the session, having listened to 3 presentations before you. If you could pull out some of the key themes and commonalities, or even perhaps a couple of the sort of slight differences that came out of the presentations, what are the 1 or 2 things that really struck you while you've been listening in the audience today?
I think that one of the themes that came through, and I think it's really important, is that you've got to focus on the audience. Different audiences have different needs, different tastes, different preferences, and you're going to want to tailor your materials to that. I think that one of the most interesting comments that I would pick up on was, I think it was Shoba who said it, about not all stories require visuals. And I think we're getting into a trap of thinking that visuals are really important. And if we go back to the origins of storyteller, it was the itinerant storyteller walking from town to town, village to village, telling stories, and he or she did not have visual aids. They didn't sketch up all sorts of things and come along with a PowerPoint deck. So we need to think about the power of what we say, and think about the power of the imagination and radio. Radio is so much more effective for many types of communication where you're expecting people to use their imagination. So I think that looking at all of those bits and pieces that we saw about focus on your audience, design materials that are right for your audience. And I think this point about using storytelling devices to smooth the path was a common theme through all 4 of the presentations today.
Okay, and a question from one of our regulars who says, sometimes clients won't share their do's with us. They ask us, provide me with an overview of the market, but I am not going to tell you what my strategic planning looks like. In such cases, what would you do to customize your story?
I would try to have some more conversations, and I would try to use my research ability to think about what their plans are likely to be. So I might then, and depending on who it is, I might be provocative with some clients, and they say, I might say, well, are we trying to maximize revenue, trial, share of voice, share of mind, profit, and they're not willing. I say, okay, well, I'm going to assume then for the purpose of this project that we're trying to maximize revenue. And then you can often tell from their face whether or not actually they are. Sometimes that problem is caused because the insight manager doesn't really know what the end client has in mind. So a lot of this conversation should have been dealt with at the design stage of the project. Of course, at the end of the day, if the client isn't going to communicate any information to you and they are going to give you a large wad of money to do the project, you're likely to do the project, in which case you just have to do your best understanding from what has been in the public media, what is in the data, what you have been able to learn from other projects, and say, these are the sorts of things that they ought to be doing with this information.
Thank you. Have you seen any good examples of people focusing more on the storytelling in the absence of visuals? Have you noticed anybody at conferences or out there who's doing some, good stuff, focusing more on the, audio side of it?
I've seen individuals do it from time to time. I can think of John Karen did a great webinar for us a few years ago, which was just voice. I think there is scope to do much more of that. Sometimes when the projector fails, somebody does their presentation without the slides, and it's really good. Now, obviously, sometimes the projector fails. The slides are indispensable because they're showing how the borders on this particular continent have moved over time, and without the visuals, that's really tricky. But I've not seen anybody who specializes in it, and that's interesting. And I think that probably makes sense, because if we come back to the point that we had from the 3 previous presentations about focusing on the audience, for some audiences, visuals are going to be important. For some audiences, the voice is going to be important. And sometimes you will have both types of people in the same room.
I mean, it strikes me that sort of the podcast medium would obviously be ideal for, to focus around some of those things.
Yeah, it is. And you raise a good point there, because the podcasts that several people are doing, like Jason down there in Australia and Priscilla over in the States and Seema Vasa, all of those are voice only. And to be honest, most times I watch the recordings of somebody else's webinar. I don't watch it, I listen to it. And if something they say means I need to see it, I suddenly hit pause, bring it back to the front and look at that a little bit. But mostly I'm doing something else and I'm listening. So quite often the visuals are there for the benefit of the storyteller to make sure they stay on track, and quite often are not necessary for the person listening.
Particularly probably more so in the style of conference presentations where we've moved more to, one picture. If you've not got the audio, the slides are not very helpful.
Absolutely. And if you do have the audio, you're often not missing that much on the slides. If I think back to the presentation I have just done, several of those slides, you didn't need to see them. It helped me to have them there. But the architecture slide would have been very difficult to convey with voice only. And if it had been a voice only presentation, I would have changed that material.
Again, thinking of your audience and then the mode by which you're delivering it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for coming along and talking more about storytelling and visualization.